Okay, well, welcome, Max, to our conversation. We're delighted to have you, and you probably know that the premise for this whole dance is that the biosphere is endangered, democracy is endangered, and even our sense of humanity is endangered as well. And so our conversation is built on that question: what does it mean to be radically human? And so we'd like to dig into that with you and talk about some of the sources of the challenges to humanity right now, and maybe some life lessons we can take away. So yeah, feel free to dive in. You have any thoughts on our endangered humanity at the moment?
Mm. Well, it's good to be with you guys again. Thanks for having me. Um, Lots of thoughts. I mean, we're in the breakdown phase of empire. I mean, I've been as I'm sure you guys have, I've been following the political situation around the world, and we're seeing now with the Trump administration, I think what you start to see with a lot of empires in decline, which is that there's sort of panic among certain factions of the ruling class. And, what institutions have been built over decades and centuries to try and preserve some vestiges of democracy and free speech and these sort of typical liberal Enlightenment values that emerged over the past couple hundred years are are sold off. They're liquidated because they're no longer useful to the purposes of those in power. It's really interesting. It makes me think about this political philosopher Sheldon Wolin, who he wrote about what he called inverted totalitarianism. And he was specifically talking about, he was writing from the United States, and he was talking about how in the United States we have this system of inverted totalitarianism where instead of one dictator who's in charge of everything, we have a system that's ostensibly democratic and ostensibly, participatory, open, free, and so on. But it functions in many ways like a dictatorship does because, various uh, elite forces have captured the apparatus of the system and tweaked the rules here, gotten favorable court rulings here, changed the regulations here, and done this again and again and again over decades, investing billions of dollars in basically corruption to and bribery and so on, revolving doors and all the other mechanisms all the other forms that takes into capturing this apparatus. And uh, so Sheldon Wolin was criticizing this sort of neoliberal world order. I think he wrote this book probably in the 90s sometime. And he was criticizing the neoliberal world order that had arisen in that time. Um, and we're seeing a shift now to a new phase of empire. It's not really clear to what extent it's going to play out because I think, as you guys know, we're seeing this clash between sort of the establishment neoliberal forces represented by the Democratic Party and forces like that. The EU kind of falls into this squarely versus this sort of new uh, conservative Leviathan force. And I don't think anyone should get it twisted in my mind, like that's a clash of two factions of the ruling class. It's not ultimately a clash between justice and democracy on one side and tyranny on the other. It's two different forms of tyranny.
Mm.
And uh, you know, uh, I would prefer one of them over the other because I think that like values like free speech and democracy open doors for political engagement that are foreclosed or become increasingly difficult under, more explicitly totalitarian systems. Um, but that's we don't know how the future is going to play out. We don't know how things are going to look. So I can say that I would probably prefer that. I would definitely prefer that, um, but it's sort of a slower burn versus the inferno. Either way, the house is burning down.
Mhm.
And that's the irony. There are so many ironies in this. Like um, when Biden was sort of uh, in the presidential campaign, still campaigning against Trump in the early days, he put out a post on social media and on his newsletters and so on saying it was a simple graph and it showed oil production in the US under Trump and oil production in the US under Biden. And he was basically saying, look, I produced twice as much oil essentially in the US as Trump did in his first term. And this was the supposedly liberal pro-climate candidate bragging to the population of the country and the world that he had doubled oil production in the US. So, it's not to understate the like dire implications of what the Trump administration is doing, not just specific things like trying to open up Anwar to drilling, approving the Ambler Road project through, uh, I think it's Gates of the Arctic National Park or one of the national parks up there in Alaska, throwing out all the NEPA implementing regulations and just the Department of Environmental or the Council on Environmental Quality. Um, there's all these really specific things that Trump is doing that are bad. But at the same time, I think it's important to recognize, I was talking to my friend Terry Lodge the other day about this, who's a really intelligent uh, attorney. He's been, sort of a movement attorney for decades, um, fighting for anti-war causes, fighting nuclear weapons, defending direct action, environmental activists, and so on. And he said, this is a direct quote from him: USAID is a corrupt neoliberal CIA affiliated front, but some of the things being funded are genuinely humanitarian. Um, he says that this is an evisceration of democracy that's happening now. And
Mhm.
I think that we can't shy away from that. And I also think that what we're seeing from the establishment Democrats, the center right, really, is an argument. Chuck Schumer was in the news the other day saying something like the problem is people don't know how much the Democrats have done for them. So, he wasn't saying like our policies suck. We sort of promised these progressive changes in society and then completely failed to deliver on them for the average working class people. Um, he was just saying like, we're perfect. There's no problem with us. We just need to communicate better because the dumb peons don't understand how good we are for them. And with messaging like that, with attitudes like that, it's no wonder that the Democrats lost. I mean, average people hate them. Just like I'm convinced that, the majority of the people who voted for Trump don't actually like him. There is sort of like the fervent MAGA element that, is very cult-like, which exists for the Democrats too. There's a fervent, Kamala cult as well. Um, but I think a lot of people just voted because they're like, screw this ultimately. And this is like Chris Hedges and many political thinkers have been predicting this kind of thing for a long time. That, Chris Hedges wrote a book called The Death of the Liberal Class, where he said, we used to have institutions and governance and education, academia in this country that was concerned with things like civic education and free speech and participation in the community and volunteerism and there are a lot of problems with that, but as you saw sort of the neoliberal turn of the Democratic Party away from unions and working class roots
Mhm.
to, we're going to get the elite votes. We're going to focus on culture war issues rather than on sort of the concrete economic reality of working class people in this country. Um, it was a downhill slope from there. I mean, this is captured, of course, um, most strikingly maybe by Hillary Clinton talking about the deplorables during her campaign. And she probably lost right there as soon as she said that, because she confirmed every stereotype of, a large chunk of the country who think that most urban, well-educated, left-leaning people are elitist assholes who look at them as inbred country hicks who know nothing or something like that.
Right.
Um, I can go on and on and on about this, and I don't know if this is the direction you guys want to take the conversation at all. We're probably here to talk more about environmental politics as well. But, I think all this obviously plays a big role in it, and it's just some of the thoughts that have been on my mind at the moment.
Hello? Yeah, I mean, yes. I mean, it's kind of like we're in a sense dealing with this accelerationist factor right now, in a sense, right? Because I think that the elites in both sectors of the right-hand side of the spectrum, which is what we've got in America today, we don't really have an active, liberal or socialist or even green party that's active in any meaningful way. And there's an acceleration going on with this kleptocratic. We saw it after the Soviet Union collapsed, right? We saw that the power players, the KGB and the big political players all went after the money. They went after capture,
Mhm.
right? And capture land, money, and power. And that's, in the face of what we're seeing now globally, it seems like that's what's happening in this country. There's that same kind of capture happening, in a sense, on both sides, really, right? I mean, I didn't see Nancy Pelosi putting all of her stocks in a blind trust, right? Like she was. So there's a lot of the same game being played. It's just one of them's punching you in the face and the other one's kicking you in the butt, right? And so which do you prefer? And that's kind of what we've been left with. And so of course the people are angry. But what does it mean, I think, in a sense, from a step down from this, what does it mean to be radically human in the face of this onslaught of just inhuman insanity?
Mm. It's a really good question. Somebody messaged me yesterday and was asking if I wanted to collaborate on a writing piece about survival. And she was saying, I've been so focused on activism and organizing in the past, and now I've kind of pivoted and I'm only focusing on survival. And
Mm.
I feel sympathetic to that. I think that survival, uh, I think that that's a legitimate uh, feeling to have. I don't personally agree with it in that I think there is a huge importance to organizing and resistance and activism, and there will continue to be. And frankly, I often find it ironic. I don't mean this in an offensive way at all, but I often find it ironic when people who are living in the heart of empire in a place like the United States, where we have, the majority of people have roofs over their heads. The economy is more or less functioning for a large percentage of the population. A lot of people are struggling, but like we're not in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. There's not a civil war actively going on. Like there's food in the grocery stores. There's, there's a healthcare system that sucks, but it exists. It is still there, right? There's, um, I struggle with the irony of people who are existing in these conditions and yet are talking about survival, because I don't think we're at that point yet. And I just think that it's a bit preemptive. That doesn't mean it's ridiculous. I've got my beans and rice in the in the laundry room over here, and I've got my own skills that I enjoy assembling and so on, and thought, I'm thinking about these issues in part because I live in the Pacific Northwest and it's the Cascadia subduction zone, so we might just get hit by that earthquake. Who knows when? Um, but this is also linked into the increasing climate disasters, into the political instability, all these different factors that could come into play at any point in the future. But these are black swan events. These things are inherently not predictable. And so um, I do not agree with the mindset that we're only in a survival situation now. And I want to link this to being radically human, because I think that as we exist in this era of the great acceleration, as people have called it, where, carbon emissions are skyrocketing, population is going up, plastic pollution, whatever issue you look at, nitrogen cycle disruption, species
Phosphorus.
extinction,
Yeah.
all of these, yeah, urbanization, corporate power, wealth inequality, all of these things are headed in the wrong direction. We're in this era of destabilization, and it makes sense to be prepared. And I think the best resource to be prepared is community and organizing. And so, as we're talking about being radically human, I'm I'm thinking about I am building relationships with my neighbors. I just moved pretty recently within the same area, so I'm still embedded in similar community, but my actual new neighbors, I'm building relationships with them because I don't know the conservative guy who lives up the street who's got, this property protected by Smith and Wesson, personal security. Like when there's a political crisis to the point where there's violence in the streets, I want to know that guy's name and have a friendly relationship with him, right? Um, I want to know the people across the street with their little daughter, so that when something goes wrong, they know that they could come over here and, we can have a friendly relationship and we can help each other. Um, and I think that like being radically human is tied into getting off the world of the screens and into our communities. Not that this isn't important, it is. The conversations we're having now, the organizing that's enabled through this, but the era in which online discourse and dialogue is going to be the main factor that changes the world, that dream is dead, as far as I'm concerned. It's been dead for a long time. I think the politically relevant approaches and forces are going to emerge from communities, from people pulling together and organizing, often in old school analog ways. And
Mhm.
I think that this ties into um, uh, we talked previously, just off camera about this idea of being a radical human, being radically human. And I read a book the other day and it was talking about there was some quote like, never underestimate the pure intimidating force of a person who won't back down. And that's something that I just read that book, a few months ago, but it's an idea that I've come back to over and over again in organizing because we can defeat ourselves in our own minds, getting into these ideas that the powers we're facing are so overwhelming, they're so huge, we have no leverage against them. And that's true. But if we don't fight, part of the way that these systems of oppression and domination and hierarchy function is they prevent you from even trying in the first place, right? Like there's in any totalitarian system, they can't watch everyone with a gun next to their head at all times. It's impossible, right? So resistance is always going to be possible. And, uh, but if we defeat ourselves in our own minds, if we say we have to give up, it's all over, um, and I don't know if the woman who I'm talking about would agree with this, but I think some people who say it's all just survival, or I recently wrote a piece called "Are We Doomed?" and I was kind of exploring this idea of doom and collapse, and um, I was trying to kind of thread the needle because I disagree with the people who are all hope all the time and all, we'll pull together and everything will be great and it'll be fine. I'm like, you're deluded. You're not following the reality of the situation we're in. But I feel the same in a lot of ways about the people who just say we're screwed, there's nothing that can be done, and so on. Because, um, you know, and I write in that piece about how, in some senses, resistance is not rational. It doesn't primarily come from here. It comes from here,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
And um, my therapist told me this a couple years ago. He was talking about grandmother Agnes, I think was her name, who was one of the 12 Council of Indigenous Grandmothers,
Mm.
something like that. And she said the most important journey that a person can take in their life is 12 inches. And it's the journey from here to here. And that's how I feel about resistance and organizing and being radically human, is that in a sense it's almost like regardless of the evidence, regardless of the opposition, regardless of the authoritarian forces that are rising, regardless of the dehumanization of technology and screens and apps and AI, regardless of the fact of how um, politically alienated we've become from a sense of power and a sense of community and belonging, and how alienated we've become from the land and sustainability. Like, regardless of all of these barriers,
Mm.
at the root, we're all human beings who require habitat, right? We live on the land. We need to drink the water. We need to eat the food. We need relationship with each other and a community in order to survive. And like any animal, we have instincts. Like, if our loved ones or ourselves are threatened, we will defend ourselves, right? Like, we are animals like any other animal. And I think that instinctual nature that we have to protect what we love and what matters to us, what we care about, to express our care and our generosity and our, positive emotions to our communities around us, to, feel righteous anger when there's injustice, when something wrong is going on, when people are getting hurt who don't deserve it. Um, to like, all of these things are part of being radically human. And it's not ultimately from up here. You can support it from up here with, facts and science and research and books and all of these things, but ultimately it comes from down here. Like, I sometimes say all of these problems we're facing are, a lot of them come down to like the ethics that you learn in kindergarten, which is like share with others,
Right.
be nice to each other, like use your words, like don't pull all the leaves off the plant, don't squash the bug just because it's there. Like, these are really, really basic ethics. We don't need PhDs to understand all these things. It's not that that's not useful, but we all have these instincts inside of us.
In terms of activism, it it seemed to me that 5 or 6 years ago, the basic thread seemed to be we have 5 or 6 years to do something, and if we go past that 5 or 6 years, then there's going to be a cascade of problems, and things will get worse. And to some extent, that seems to be true. We are at a point now where no one is talking about 1.5. And I'm not sure people are realistically even talking about two. So, so in the sense of the people that are saying survival, and I strongly agree with your position on this, but it does seem that the type of activism or resistance uh, may have to change given the circumstances.
Yeah.
And I have a feeling that between the four of us, we'd all agree that one big part of that would be we have to be honest with ourselves and change ourselves, make sure we're willing to face what's happening. But in terms of like strategic organizing, what are your thoughts about effective ways that we can be active in the struggle given the circumstances we face today?
Yeah, great questions. There are a few thoughts that come to mind. One is, I have a friend, I don't know him very well, but Ashish Joshi, he's from Nepal. And I went to a talk that he did with another friend of mine, Aaron Remblance, the other day, online. And he was just talking about how sort of the structure of the debate was around this paper that was published by a prominent degrowth advocate who was saying that essentially we have the productive capacity around the world to give everyone a modest European standard of living with refrigerators and, basic heat and cooling and these types of things. And my friend Ashish was saying, I think he was, fundamentally generous to this perspective, saying like, okay, it makes sense that you're doing this research, but there's a big flaw here, which is like one, which is that like this is a level of utopian thinking that is probably not relevant given the political realities of the situation we're in now. Like the global north is not going to engage in a voluntary degrowth activities so that people in the global south can raise up their standard of living in the poorest countries in the world. It's just not happening. And he's like, look, there's an active genocide going on right now. Like they're this type of thinking can kind of obscure these political realities in some way by putting people's faith in some sort of magical transformation that isn't happening. And um, and he said a similar thing in regard to the climate negotiations. He said, the global south countries should stop asking for climate reparations, like the loss and damages fund or whatever they call it, from the global north, because the global north just isn't going to do it substantively. Like what has been offered in the past is often like loans that they have to pay back, or it's the very small amount of funds that comes with lots of stipulations on how they can be used and what they must be spent on. And you got to buy the solar panels from us that we're gonna pay for part of for you to put on your whatever. So he was just arguing like global south countries should abandon the idea that the global north is going to save them and try and step out of this almost drama triangle of that makes it sound like a small issue. It's not. I'm not trying to minimize it at all, but in some ways has similar dynamics to that psychological idea of the drama triangle, where you have the victim and you have the rescuer and then you have the whatever the third. Yeah, the perpetrator.
Yeah.
And instead focus on, he was saying that like
Uh-oh.
much between the global south nation as a whole and the global north nation. And he was saying like, look, we got our own problems here that we got to deal with. We've got our own elites who are screwing our people over, who are destroying the land here, who are making deals with, foreign companies and selling the resources and destroying the land and so on. He was like, we don't have, time and energy to waste on this sort of pie in the sky idealism. We need to get to work with what we do have. And I think this is somewhat relevant, John, to your question. The other point that I wanted to bring up is I recently started working with the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund, CELDIF, which has done a lot of rights of nature work for many years. And I've always admired them from afar. I've known a couple people in there over the years, but I've admired them from afar because they have had a hard-headed approach. They have gone into these communities and said, look, here's the rights of nature. Here's what it is. We can help you draft laws to pass this in your community, but here's what's going to happen. These laws are illegal under US law. And when you pass one of these laws, a corporation or even the state that you live in is going to sue whatever jurisdiction passed the law, the town or the county or whatever that passed the rights of nature law. They will sue you, and they're going to win that case. They're going to win the lawsuit because, the state Supreme Court or whatever federal court or whatever will say it is illegal in the United States to give rights to nature or to recognize the inherent rights of nature. And that's the law of the land. It's the law of the land is that there is what's called state preemption and federal preemption. So it's illegal for a local community to make an environmental law that's stronger than the existing state law or the existing federal law, because they have preempted the state authority. And now you have states all across the country, I think Utah and Florida have both done it, which have preemptively, they passed a law at the state level banning local communities from implementing rights of nature laws. So even if 100% of the community in, whatever town votes, we want a rights of nature law in our community, the state says, no, you can't do that. Sorry, democracy is just just a bit of a sham here, right?
Right.
Um, and so what's interesting to me is that the organization is in the midst of this pivot right now, where they've been doing this work for many years. They've been telling communities this. And the idea all along was we're going to work with communities to try and pass these laws. We're going to use this to try and change the culture, to try and normalize the idea of rights of nature, which has been successful, I think, to a large extent among certain sectors of the population. And, internationally, it's grown quite a bit. Um, and we're also going to radicalize people by exposing them to the reality that democracy, as currently set up in the United States, doesn't really exist. You have the right to vote, but you have the right to vote for basically the approved corporate candidates who can raise enough money to get in,
Right.
and you have the right to control over your community, but not when it comes to whether or not there are going to be carcinogens in your air, whether or not the climate, destroying pipeline is going to run under your city, whether or not, the oil refinery is going to continue operating on the outskirts of town. You don't actually have any democracy over that.
Right.
Um, and the idea was radicalize people with that. Like people get exposed to that and they realize, okay, we need to do more. And because of this approach for 10, 15, 20 years, CELDF helped hundreds of communities like come face to face with the realities of power.
Mm.
And the challenge was what comes next, right? Because these communities did understand, and a lot of people do understand that this system is very flawed, that it was set up to be protective of corporate power, and you can go into the details and the deep history of that and talk about how, the Federalists basically staged a coup at the founding of this country, essentially, and like undermined all the local democracy and radical stuff that Thomas Paine and, the more sort of democracy oriented people in the American Revolution were talking about. And of course, it was all built on stolen land and slavery and so on. So there are layers of this. Um, but the organization is pivoting because of this, and we're trying to figure out like what does it look like to build both community resistance and resilience in the face of what's coming, to recognize the fact that, like you just said, John, like it's too late for 1.5. It's probably too late for 2. We're in for very dramatic, very difficult future. And there is a level of pure adaptation which is going to be required to that. Like supply chains are going to be breaking down, food production is going to be imperiled. We're going to be seeing larger and larger refugee crises, more and more natural disasters, unnatural disasters. But at the same time, on top of that, you've got increasing corporate pillaging. You've got these new authoritarian forces rising. You've got, all of these different issues that need to be resisted still, that need to be organized against and fought and pushed back against. Um, and so, we're looking at how do you build coalitions and alliances and relationships to try and bring together people from different aspects of these types of movements. Like there are so many people, I'm here in the Willamette Valley, which is a great food growing region, right? And there's so many people in this area who are involved in organic farming, small scale, and permaculture projects, and agroforestry, agroecology, and these sort of various farmers markets, and these sort of various, not always anti-capitalist, but sort of they're largely out. They're not agribusiness, right? They're not entirely profit driven. They're driven by people just trying to make a basic living and get by, even if they're not officially nonprofits or something like that. But those movements are largely disconnected from the forest defense movement, from the climate movement, from from people who are involved in other issues. And we're going to need to build more interconnections between these movements as we go forward, you know, not just because of sort of the survival aspect, but because like we need grand strategy, right? We need high level thinking about what we're doing and why, what are the proper ways to sort of sequence and organize that work and to direct it towards specific goals, And so we're also thinking about things like rights of nature laws and assemblies and these sort of alternative political formations that, a lot of radical organizers have talked about for many years under the category of dual power, you know, like as and this isn't something that we came up like this is an old idea that people came up with. I don't know if it comes from I don't know where it comes from exactly. Maybe you guys know the history, but I have a feeling it might have been some of the Eastern European countries under communism sort
Mhm.
of came up with this term of dual power, and
Right,
they
the
were like,
parallel polis.
Yeah.
yeah,
Dual
parallel
power.
polis.
So there's also a Northwest tradition, the IWW and the Wobblies, and having a new world creating a new world within the old. I
Mhm,
think but honestly, an Oregon
mhm.
and Washington phenomena.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we need that. Like we need this badly. And I think we also are just in a time where um, it's really easy for people to get discouraged, and we need to stick together. We're coming out of, I'd like to think we're coming out of an era of left politics that was characterized by like extreme infighting and mistrust and lack of dialogue, lack of collaboration and coalition building. Um, and I think there are definite reasons for that. I think, I just read Norman Finkelstein's recent book that was called "I'll Burn That Bridge When I Get to It: Heretical Thoughts on Identity Politics" and something or other. And he's basically making the argument that a lot of radicals have made for many years that like this sort of modern version of identity politics that has popped up over the last 10 years or probably more like 20, 25 years um, is like a watered down version of what has existed in radical movements for centuries, which is like recognizing the realities of race and class and sex and gender and how these things play out and building radical movements that build coalitions of people across these differences and bring people together because, the working class and the planet being destroyed, these issues cut across everything. And movements have always understood that these different systems of power are layered on top of each other and interact with each other. But the way that it's sort of come out and expressed itself over the last, like I said, 15, 20, 25 years has been through this, I don't know, sort of purity politics that's made it very difficult for people to organize and work together across these differences. And I've that's something that I've grappled with myself. Like I don't, when we went to Thacker Pass and started building relationships with native folks and, organizing with the tribes and going out to the reservation and so on, like there's inherently going to be challenges in cross-cultural organizing just because you're different. Like I didn't grow up on the res in Northern Nevada, I don't have that experience. I'm different. I grew up in Seattle, like totally different childhood, life experience, culture, everything. And that has its own challenges, right? But we build the relationships anyway because we're human and we have so much overlaps. We're radically human, you could say. And we have these things that are in common and we have shared values and we find the people who have the shared values and so on. But then I find, trying to collaborate with younger people, especially coming out of urban areas and universities and more education and so on, um, was really difficult in the Thacker Pass campaign. And I think it was often because with those people, their politics were not radically human, unfortunately. And I say this with the utmost compassion because I think it's a very sad thing that so many people's sense of what activism is, what organizing is, has now come down to activism is when you identify the person in your community or in your group who's done something wrong, who's said the wrong words, who's used the wrong terms, who's made a mistake in some ways, and you kick them out of the group, you publicly shame them, you make it impossible for them to participate in events or in the community in any way. And for a lot of people, that's what activism is in this sort of extremely online era. And that, I want to respect the impulse underlying it because people want justice, they want respect, they want to set boundaries. Like these are all really good underlying impulses, and I want to recognize that and honor that. But the way that it has come out has been really destructive across our movements, I would say. Um, and you know, it's not necessarily. There's a lot of people who are criticizing this. A lot of people talk about call out culture and the alternative being call in culture, which is like, how do we develop a culture in our activist groups and in our communities, which I would say is more radically human, where you recognize that we're all flawed, we're all messed up. Like, we all have our issues, we all make mistakes, we've all done things that we're not proud of, that we're very ashamed of. We all change over time. Our opinions change. Um, and we should give each other grace, and we should learn to forgive and learn to communicate and understand each other. And dare I say, talking about my neighbors earlier, we should learn to build relationships even when we have significant political differences,
Yes.
on the basis of those areas where we do overlap and we do have shared values. Because, I did an event many years ago with Jeanette Armstrong, who's Okanagan native. And she talked about the tradition in her culture. They have this whole process. I'm not going to try and pronounce the name because I'll ruin it. Maybe I'll try. It's like Anaukin or something like that. I'm probably saying it very wrong, so I apologize. But it's a tradition that's sort of like a conflict resolution thing. I don't understand the concept in a ton of detail. So again, apologies if I'm not communicating the full nuances of it, which I know I'm not. But the underlying idea is like from her community, tribal community, they've lived there for whatever, hundreds, thousands of years. I don't know their history exactly of where, but the idea is um, if you and I have a conflict, our kids and our grandkids and our great grandkids are going to have to live in the same community. So, like, we got to figure something out. We got to come to some sort of accommodation so we can live next to each other at least. Doesn't mean we're going to be best friends, but like when there's a harsh winter and my family's really hungry and you get a deer and you're sharing with anyone else, like, I'm going to need your help because next winter I might be the one who gets the deer and I want to share, like, you're going to need help too, right? And so that's the thing. Like, I took an environmental negotiation class in college and they talked about how the basis of negotiation is finding those points of overlap and shared values. And if you don't have those, they said, negotiation is worthless. And that is the case sometimes, if you're fighting a lithium mining company, for example, their primary interest is coming in and blowing up the mountain and taking the lithium. And our primary interest in opposing them was the mountain not being blown up. And there's no negotiation there. There's just conflict, right? So it's not always going to be possible to resolve things. Um, but I think it's really important that we try and that we take a radically human approach to doing so.
Nice. Well, one theme that has come up for us a number of times, we talk a lot about stress and the amount of stress that's coursing through, you might say, the collective unconscious of humanity right now, and how that distorts our normal human behavior. And if we're going to make any progress on any of these issues, we have to get people to calm down
Yeah.
because when people make stress motivated decisions, or we tend to do poorly.
Yeah.
So where do you come down on trying to help people to relax in the face of all of this?
Yeah. Well, I know that's been a big focus of your work in some ways, Frank, is like how, not just relaxation, but like regulating the nervous system, and we live in such a profoundly dysregulated culture and society. The norm is like hyper stress, not enough sleep, crappy food, like crappy relationships, on my phone all the time, just distracting yourself with addictions and drugs and all these other things. Um, and you're right, like you can't build relationships meaningfully across differences when you're in that state. It's impossible. And I think there's an element um, in which that's being done deliberately, right? Like
Right.
there's been studies on social media that show like when people are angry and upset and these different emotions, then they'll stay on longer and they'll keep scrolling and they'll see
Mhm.
more ads and generate more income and so on. And there's also an element in which it's like a runaway train at this point. Like the brake, no one has control anymore, the organic forces of society are just generating more and more stress for people, and there's no one can like stop that train. Um, so I was talking with my brother-in-law about this the other day, and he was saying that we need social change theorists often talk about like the 2 or 3% of the population that you need to, and I think we talked about this on our last interview a while back. And he was saying like we need those people to not just be active, but to be regulated, to be like,
Mm.
have some level of spiritual balance to them. And this is I was at an event in 2020, and it was sort of this anyway, it was this event, and I was giving a talk, and I was talking about confrontation and self-defense and organizing and direct action and these sort of challenging topics for the audience, which was sort of a typical more liberal progressive middle-aged audience who weren't very comfortable with those ideas.
Mm.
And afterwards, one of them came up to me and they said something like, this woman, she said something like, I was able to hear it differently when you said it than when most people talk about these ideas um, because I get the sense that you're well loved. It was something like that. She was like, I get the sense that. So I wrote that down. I was like the well-loved warrior versus the patho-adolescent warrior, because that's what we were talking about, in the event, was like the fact that most people in this culture across the political spectrum are basically stuck in their emotional development of their personality at the adolescent stage, at the teenage stage,
Yes.
and that's their level of emotional maturity. People have said Trump is this, but it's not just the adolescent, because there are a lot of 12, 13, 14, 15 year olds who are great people, and so adolescent doesn't necessarily mean bad, but it's the patho-adolescent, it's the pathological adolescent stage that is, it's rejecting everything. It's me against the world. It's the adolescent forces that are like driving the epidemic of self-harm and
Mhm.
and like bullying that we see in schools and school shootings and all these things, like the patho-adolescent. And I think that what that woman was saying to me was that most activists and people who are out there talking about the need for confrontation and organizing and resistance are in this state. And I'm not trying to say that I'm like some evolved being or something like that, but she was just trying to point out that like I didn't have that energy, that masculine dominant energy around that of like we need to fight, we need to get together and fight the police and smash the system and so on. I was talking in some ways about some similar ideas with some overlaps, but I was trying to do so in a much more measured way that wasn't really driven by um, sort of, it was driven perhaps in part by righteous anger, but also by love, and not by a sort of reactive, uncontrolled series of emotions.
Mhm.
Um, and I think we need to build that. We need to build that capacity in whatever ways possible. I'm not a big expert on that, but this is actually really good that we're talking about it because I'm wanting to bring this now to some of my organizing groups and talk about, because we're talking about coalition building and so on, and bringing people together who are involved in these different arenas and different types of groups and local food and direct action and direct democracy and assemblies and all these different areas, strikes and workers organizing. And it's making me think we need to bring in the folks from the Buddhist temple up on the hill over here. We need to bring in the folks from the church. We need to bring in the meditation teacher and the therapist and these type of people who specialize in regulation
Mhm.
and can help bring that into political movement,
Mhm.
and have that sort of be incorporated from the ground level.
Mhm.
So thanks for that, Frank.
What about the idea of how would perspective uh, relate to the idea of stress? In other words, uh, sort of looking at the scale of the overall issue,
Mhm.
that someone who approaches it spiritually may say, well, this is a serious problem, and we've had serious problems before, and it's probably not a problem that's going to be resolved during my lifetime.
Hmm.
And therefore, I need to take certain actions. And in the course of putting this in perspective, it would seem to me that the stress would go down. And
Yeah.
of course, to me, that's the primary purpose of bringing in people with a spiritual background, that they could help, define the playing field versus people that right now we're talking about. Well, we have no choice but to support the Democrats in 2028, so we need to go out in the street and start doing A, B, C, and D. And as you said, the pressure forces people to make bad decisions.
Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts on how perspective or scale would help this issue of stress?
Yeah. Well, it does bring me back to the conversation about spirituality, and it's reminding me of a book I read last year called The Dharma in Difficult Times, which is written by a guy named Stephen Cope, who I believe he was or is a Buddhist monk. But it's about, he basically profiles something like 6 or 8 people who were involved in social change movements in these really intense periods throughout history. So, like one guy who was a soldier during the Civil War. Um, he talks about Gandhi. He talks about some other people who I don't remember, like people who are involved in abolitionist movements and other movements. And he basically just talks about how these folks, um, ultimately, their resistance, their work, their determination, and their drive was not, again, sort of rooted in rationality. It was rooted in something ineffable that, it just came in them. It was rooted in their sort of, uh, you could call it spiritual belief, or you could call it moral or ethical belief that was just, again, it's sort of the from here to here conversation. Because I think if you're up here, it's really easy to get in the mindset of it's so big, there's nothing we can do, it's overwhelming, we're never going to stop it. The scale is too big.
Mhm.
Whereas you get down here and it's easier to understand that, it's easier to feel, not to understand, to feel that I am one part of something that is much larger. And all I can influence is what I can influence. And I have to give up a sense of control over what I can't. That doesn't mean giving up. It doesn't mean giving up hope or giving up, that nothing will ever change or feeling despair. But it does mean understanding what I can and can't do given my circumstances, my skills, my location, my situation, um, and focusing on what I can do and trying to give that the best possible effort that I can. I mean, this is like a basic principle of sport. This is why I think like everyone should play sports when they're a kid and ideally should get coached by really good coaches, because the best coaches will say it doesn't matter if you win or not ultimately. Like it's not about the score. What
So,
matters is, are you going to go out and are you going to try your best? Are you going to do the best for yourself, and for your teammates,
So
aka your community and the world,
you're totally channeling John Wooden here,
hmm
the great basketball coach. I mean, that's exactly what he was saying. He said, focus on practice. Don't focus on the game. Don't focus on the outcome of the game. It's
Yeah.
showing up day after day, doing your best, and
Mhm.
that's a habit of
Yeah.
practice. It's about how we show up every
And
day.
of course, John Wooden's teams won what, like 12
Right,
national championships or
right.
right,
something. And
right.
that's not
Yeah,
an accident. Like
yeah.
when you take that humble approach of show up and do the work, do the best you can every single day, relentlessly, the outcomes will change.
Mhm,
That
mhm.
doesn't mean everything's going to be great and perfect. Some of his teams lost, right?
Right.
But I mean, I'm a big basketball fan, so yeah, I totally know John Wooden.
Yeah.
And I follow the Thunder, and this basketball team right now, that's one of the top teams in the NBA, and they're interestingly kind of taking a very similar approach where they were really terrible 3 or 4 years ago, but through the time of being terrible, they always had the mindset of, if you're going to be on the court and play, you got to show up and play defense. Nobody's going to go out, even if the best player goes out there and they're not focused, they're not putting in their best effort, they're going to get pulled off the court. And it's not, retribution or something like that. It's just trying to teach, like, this is where we focus, this is where we apply ourselves, and this is the culture that we're building here.
Mhm.
Um,
The other good
and
thing the Thunder do is that at the end of the game, the sportscasters always want to talk to one person who they think is the best player. The
yeah,
Thunder doesn't allow them to do that. They always have 4 or 5 people standing there being interviewed. So
yeah.
you have to deal with them as a team, which is, part of their success.
Mm.
Yeah, and it goes from top to bottom in an organization like that, because the
Right.
general manager of that basketball team has this quote that I wrote down when I first heard it, that I thought was just a really important quote. He said, "People that are elite at what they do are also the ones that do the most monotonous parts of their craft with excellence."
Mhm, mhm.
And that's the humility. Like, work is not flashy. It's not glitz and glamour. The work is like, you turned your foot the wrong way on defense, right here, and like, study this tape. Let's figure out why you did that, and let's practice it 100 times, 1,000 times until you get it right the next time, you
Yep.
know?
Yep.
And, this I think this has a lot of implications for our social movements too. Like, it's not glamorous. I watched this great video the other day that a friend shared with me, where this political thinker was talking about how, people often will say dramatic things like, "I'm ready to die for the movement." "I'm ready to die to free Palestine, to, you know, save the climate, to whatever the issue is." Um, And he was saying, like, okay, that's great, but it's easy to say. Like, we need people to live for these things. We
Right.
need people to dedicate to it relentlessly, to put in the work day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year, decade after decade, because that's what social movements and social change are built out of. We see these dramatic moments, like Rosa Parks sits down on the bus, and starts the Montgomery bus boycott. People think that was a spontaneous decision because that's the way it was taught in school. It wasn't, of course. She went to the Highlander Center, she got trained, she was with Martin Luther King and all these other movement leaders. They drew out a very specific strategy of what they were going to do and how they were going to do it. They, built alliances and coalitions, brought people on board. And then at the end of, probably years and years and years of boring, exhausting, behind the scenes grunt work that was not glamorous, was not in the news. A lot of it was probably done by people completely for free who aren't getting paid. You know,
Mhm.
your family's calling because why aren't you home for dinner? You're hungry because you've been in a meeting for 4 hours. You're like, and then at the end of it, you have the one action that helps kick it off, right? And I think that that's really important.
Mm,
Beautiful,
yeah.
beautiful.
So what's next for you, Max? What are you planning for the next 6 months, if you can predict that far ahead?
Well, I'm finishing up my master's degree in degrowth right now, and I'm working on my thesis project, which is looking at planned lithium mining in the Democratic Republic of the Congo and trying to. Uh, I'm working with some other researchers, including one guy who's from the DRC, and so we've got some interviews of people on the ground, and we're also sort of looking at the political economy of the situation and trying to just lay out, how the DRC is sort of kept in this economically subordinate position in the global economy and used as a resource colony for the global north. And I'm not really under any illusion that an academic paper is going to change the world, but I do think that, people pay more attention to experts, to people who have credentials, because credentials generally mean that you've studied and, your work has been vetted by others and so on. So, I probably wouldn't have gone down that road, but because I'm being sued by Lithium Nevada, that's put a big damper on my ability to be out on the front lines right now. Um, and so I figured, okay, this is a good time to take a couple years, get a master's degree, and get that under my belt so that when the time comes to get back out there, I can do a little better than I did before. So a lot of homework and early mornings and that type of, grunt work that's not interesting. But my hope is that by putting in the time, by studying these things, by doing this very unglamorous stuff, I can be more effective and contribute a little bit more when the time comes for that. Um, and help our movements succeed and thrive. So I'm also working, I mentioned, with the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund, CELDF. And so we're kind of ramping up in that process of organizational change, new strategy, shifting gears, building coalitions and alliances across movements, trying to bring people together, not with us as a leader or anything like that, but with just us as trying to help facilitate.
Okay.
Because often it's such a struggle for groups to, everyone says, great, alliances, coalitions, that's great. But people are busy, people are involved in the campaign and the project and they have their commitments. And so we're trying to see if we can contribute to the broader movement in this way by bringing people together, helping facilitate some of that relationship building and strategizing and collaboration so that we can be more effective, so that when we show up to fight a pipeline or a project like that, it's not just the direct action folks, it's a broader swath of sort of oppositional and resistance and resilience groups and organizations and individuals that are showing up with their skills, their resources, their people, to be able to have a more sort of holistic alternative and opposition to the system that's destroying the planet right now. So that's pretty exciting work, and we're getting ready to. We're also still doing some rights of nature stuff as well. That's not going away. There's a bill in New York that we're working on right now that hopefully will make some progress in that community that's focused on the rights of the Great Lakes and all the watersheds in New York State. Um, and yeah, keeping busy. Spring's here, so got some peas in the ground in the garden over here, and just looking forward to getting outside more and continuing to organizing my community and try and be more radically human.
Nice. Well, that's a good way to wrap it up. We're running out of time, but we're just so happy and excited to have you come and talk with us. We've had a great session. Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks for the great questions and discussion. I found this conversation very stimulating. Got some good ideas.
Yes, thank you for coming today. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for spending time with us.
Yeah. Yeah.